Even in the post-civil rights era, racism and discrimination still plague the United States. Acts of bias are typically subtle. These often unconscious and subtle acts are referred to as microaggressions. Microaggressions describe the automatic and nonverbal exchanges, which are put-downs. Racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights towards people of color. There are three types of microaggressions: micro-insults, micro-assaults, and micro-invalidations, all of which this film will depict. On a quest to be a voice for affected students across the nation, Joshua Lovell visited multiple major cities, capturing the subjective perspective of students from various walks of life. These cities include Boston, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Charleston, Los Angeles, Princeton, and New York. The film not only depicts the experience and hardships faced by students of color, but also offers ways in which we can combat this issue. It gives both victims and perpetrators insight with regard to the magnitude of this dilemma.
Hi, my name is Chelsea, and I'm currently a junior at Columbia University. A time that I've experienced microaggression and the way that it's impacted me as a Black woman would definitely be not necessarily in the context of what we typically consider microaggression, but more or less like what happens when Black bodies, like Black experiences, are silenced in spaces, and what happens to us in those environments when we should have allies that speak out, when white people should have an understanding of the ways in which like their words affect us, and how that ultimately leads to the silencing like of our voices in these spaces. And so for me, a lot of that has to do with an academic setting. In my experience, just going to a predominantly white institution, and how when we have these conversations that center around the white narrative and white history and white experiences, there is this affirmation of that, right? But then when it's time to look at art, when it's time to look at texts that are written by Black authors, Black artists, there's this hesitancy to really engage with that literature and with that work. And what does that mean in terms of like our culture and whether or not that's valued? And so I've experienced that a lot. And just for me as a Black woman, it becomes difficult because people expect that when it's the Black author that the professor's talking about, that immediately, because you're the Black person in the room, you're the one who should talk about it, right? And so it's really difficult because even when considering the things that affect us when we're dealing with police brutality and all of those issues, when we go to a classroom and all of these things are like weighing us down, how does the white response correlate to that, right? And so typically when we hear about another police shooting, like that causes a lot of trauma in the Black community, but then you enter white spaces and everyone is just completely unaffected by this and unfazed. And so how do they even respond to like your attitude and the way that you interact with them in the world, automatically labeling you as, you know, like the angry Black woman or having an attitude or being unapproachable, when that's not necessarily the case. It's just that the burdens that you carry obviously are a lot more difficult, especially being in those spaces. And so like how do we challenge white people to understand that it's more than just being a student? Like we carry the burdens of our communities, of our families, and all of those experiences ultimately should be taken into consideration in settings, and it's not just what you see at face value, because there's a lot more to that.
They've affected me more like in my childhood and like my early teen years than they have affected me as much here at Columbia. Being from Richmond, Virginia, which used to be the capital of the Confederacy, I was definitely in an area that was very pro-slavery, reenactment kind of stuff, and so that history was very apparent, and it kind of continued into these later years. And so in elementary school, I remember like the first day of kindergarten, I came in and my hair was kind of like this, and the first thing that happened was everyone stuck their hands in my hair. We're talking about how soft it is and how cute it was. And I was like 5 years old, so I knew I didn't like it, but I couldn't put into words why this made me uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I got to like middle school that I understood that that was a microaggression. The definition being something that is racist or aggressive, but done in such a way that the person didn't actually mean it.
Alright, I go to school in a really rural area. The city right next to the school I go to is 1% African American. So it's about 38 African Americans in that city next to the school I go to. And back when I was in my undergrad, I played both basketball and soccer. And now that I'm in grad school, I can go places and people will look at me and they'll be like, "Oh man, how's your team doing?" I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, "Aren't you on the basketball team?" And I'm like, "No." And it blows their mind when I tell them that I play soccer. They look at me like I'm crazy. They don't even know that my background is that I'm African. But they just look at me, they see that I'm black, and they see that I'm tall, and they want to stereotype me and put me into a sport. And the amount of times that it happens, I mean, I'd be rich if I got $1 for every time somebody said something about me and basketball. And a lot of people don't even know I didn't even start playing basketball until I got to high school. Never played. I was a soccer player. And so it's just, it's tough too, because when you're in college, there's these stereotypes of what basketball players are. So I can say, "Oh yeah, I'm a basketball player," and they're already gonna stereotype me. And so it's just little things, these little comments. Instead of asking me, "Hey, what sport do you play?" they try and categorize me and say, "Oh, do you play basketball?" And that microaggression, it's very small, and it doesn't anger me at the moment, but it's over time hearing the same statement, "Oh, you play basketball, do you play for this team, do you play for that team?" Now I'm out of school, I haven't played basketball for almost 3 years, and it's starting to get old.
Hi, so I'm a recent Princeton graduate and I'm a Korean American student. I was born and raised in America, and English was my second language, but I speak it natively. And so I identify really as an American, but my day-to-day life as an Asian woman has been full of microaggressions. It's full of, even the just like, "Where are you from? Where are you really from?" Those questions, like, it might for you be like just trying to figure out where people's parents are from, but to me that's a microaggression. Like, why can't I be American? So growing up, I grew up in the South, and as an Asian woman I got many like jokes and assumptions that I was a bad driver, that I'm supposed to be good at math, that I have a tiger mom, all at once, while like being submissive. If I was too assertive, then I was bossy. If I was too quiet, I was submissive. There was never this, like, I could never just find the right point.
Yeah. And you say Shy City, Shy City, Shy City. I'm coming home again.
Hi, my name is Anthony Downer from the University of Chicago. Microaggressions have been a large and pretty unavoidable part of my college experience. I remember when I first got on campus, I was in the residence hall and I was feeling really homesick, so I went downstairs to watch BET, which is the Black Entertainment Network here. White students were walking by, they would stop and look curiously, but then one white student stopped and said, whispered to himself, I don't think he was talking to me, but he said, "Why do black people have their own channel?" And before I could, get up and challenge him on it, one of my white friends stepped in and was talking and explaining to him. But that was probably my first experience with microaggressions on campus. And from there, they've been, like I said, a major part of my experience. from the classroom, from the residence hall, dining hall, everywhere on campus.
My name is Justin Vargas, and I'm a student here at the University of Chicago. On campus, I actually major in history, so a lot of the things we talk about have to do with imperialism and the likes of that. And I remember one of the hardest experiences with microaggressions was when I was in a U.S. history class and we were talking about Puerto Rico, which is a Commonwealth of the United States. And one of the students was discussing a time when Puerto Rican women were subjected to sterilization in order to help with the creation of birth control. And the white student claimed that this was a positive effect on science because it helped create birth control, even though thousands of women lost their ability to have children. So that was really
Hi, my name is Lovell, and I'm a sophomore here at University of Southern California. And a microaggression I commonly experience is people asking me how I got to USC, as in what sport did I play or like what kind of music do I do, and they just assume it's not through my academics, and that's usually what it is for most black people here. And another one is DPS, which is a Department of Public Safety, who like patrol USC grounds. They will, if they see a group of like me and my friends walking around at night, they'll assume that we don't go there and like ask us for our IDs and just like, you know, try to make 100% sure that we go there when like any other person walking around late at night can just freely walk by. And those are the two ones that I've definitely experienced.
So I think that this is an important issue to talk about now more than ever. There are a lot of people that exhibit microaggressions without identifying as people that have issues with gender or race or cultures from different backgrounds. I remember at one point I had a professor that really had issues with the way people wrote, and when they wrote from their frame of reference, no matter their race or their gender, if they didn't identify the way she identified, she'd find issues with their work. And so I watched her go around the room, and when she finally got to me to criticize mine, I decided to go to upper level management and talk to faculty and people that are in charge about the situation. And things were handled and rectified, and made me feel good to have belief in the institution, because I know that microaggressions aren't cool.
Out in my mind is when I was much younger. I think I was maybe middle school or fifth grade, and the teacher was giving a map of Los Angeles, which is where I'm from. And so he was giving understandings of where downtown LA was versus West LA and different communities. And when he got to South Central LA area, he said, "Oh, there's nothing there. You know, let's continue the study of the geology of Los Angeles." And I was like, "Well, that's where I'm from. What do you mean nothing's there?" You know, and little things like that would make me feel uncomfortable about where I was from, where I grew up, and what I called home. And I feel like those things can affect the way you see yourself as a person of color, the way you see yourself in certain spaces, the way you carry yourself. It matters.
So my advice for perpetrators is definitely to understand that your privilege is something that wasn't somehow like created, right? In the sense that like you aren't where you are because like you woke up and all of a sudden like whiteness existed and racial divide existed. Like there is a long history that has created a society in which like you on an everyday basis benefit from, and as a result it's your responsibility to then understand like how your ancestors and how that legacy now impact people today. Because the thing is that people of color have to live with these experiences on a day-to-day basis, and it's not their responsibility to therefore educate you. It's your responsibility to do that, especially concerning the fact that your actions have real world implications for not even just people who live in your country, but on a global scale. And so understanding how your biases, implicit, explicit, how they therefore transfer into the interactions you have with people, and how, of course, those biases then as you get older, become what inform your policy decisions, the way that you think, the way that you interact in the work environment, your views on women, your views on minorities. It's important to realize that like all of this is something that needs to be addressed, and at the very least early on. And so when considering not only what's the advice for perpetrators, but what is the advice for a system that has allowed this to continue and be a pervasive deficit like in our society, in which there's this social stratification hierarchy that exists, the answer of course is that we need to address this in a systemic way. That comes from, of course, education reform and the ways that we teach people the history. It's a problem when you go in history textbooks and you see the fact that like slaves, they're coded, right? So it's like they're servants. No, like they weren't servants, they were slaves, they were in bondage, right? It's like understanding what that means to have a dialect that reflects the truth of our history. And so, of course, now considering what's the advice to those who have to deal with this, I don't necessarily see us who have to deal with microaggressions as victims, because we aren't victims, we're survivors, right? And so with that being said, we have to consider the ways that we can push forward and create a society that, at the very least, the future generation does not have to deal with this. And that's, of course, going to take a lot of time, but we can get there. And our ancestors, of course, were standing on their backs to ensure that that happens.
Okay, so for the perpetrators of microaggressions, I would first tell you that you need to acknowledge that what you did affected someone else. I think a lot of the times when people say things that are hurtful, they just feel like that other person is taking it too seriously. But I feel like we can't get anywhere if you just feel like everyone else is really sensitive. So the first thing you need to do is accept that whatever you said was offensive. And then you need to be cognizant of what you can do in the future to not do that again. And you need to understand that why what you said was hurtful. So in the case of the cocaine situation, when a boy asked me if I did cocaine because I look like I did cocaine, the first thing he should have done was acknowledge that what he said was racist and hurtful based on the history of the Black community and drugs, and how what he was saying was essentially condemning me as someone that should not be at an institution like Columbia, or someone who is not, or someone who would just be at parties all the time in order to make a profit from drugs. And so he needed to have understood that what he said was based on a system that he might not have initially thought of but needed to grasp. And then from then on, he should have listened to what I told him as to why that was a problem, and then taken that to heart. Throughout the rest of the night, he did apologize profusely, but there's a difference between you apologizing and you actually making a difference.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
I was talking and explaining to him, but that was probably my first experience with microaggressions on campus. And from there, they've been, like I said, a major part of my experience, from the classroom, from the residence hall, dining hall, everywhere on campus. I think that students need to know, whether you're a victim or a perpetrator of microaggressions, that they're not okay. They need to be talked about on campus. White students in particular need to do more work to help us with diversity and inclusion. And the inclusion piece is really where we start talking about microaggressions. So what I've seen on campus is the same students, the same victims, the same advocates talking about microaggressions, trying to reduce them, but we're missing the piece with the perpetrators. So white students, perpetrators need to step up, they need to join the conversation, they need to help curb their own behaviors.
when it comes to students who face microaggressions every day and students who perpetrate it, it's important to understand that you don't need to internalize something like this. If you face a microaggression, you should be honest with yourself and honest with the people who perpetrate it so that you don't hide behind anything. And I think that perpetrators need to realize that at the end of the day, when someone is telling you that what you do is wrong, your job is to listen, respect that, and change the way that you are.
So, little advice to the victims. Don't stay quiet when people say something that's like a microaggression towards you. Because a lot of times, the perpetrators, they don't even realize that it's microaggression. I think a lot of microaggression is unintentional, but even if it's unintentional, it's still microaggression. And so as a victim, you need to say something about it. You need to say, hey, actually, I'm not a basketball player, I'm a soccer player. I'd prefer next time if you just ask me what sport I play, versus trying to categorize me and think because of whatever reason that I play this sport. Because they may not know, and I think a lot of times people, they think that I've never said a microaggressive comment, but it's because people like us who are getting victimized, they don't speak out about it and they just take it. And that's what makes microaggression so dangerous. So I think the victims of microaggression needs to say something so that way hopefully we can raise awareness of it and put a stop to it.
We really address microaggressions. If you feel like somebody's making a joke or just a negative, even like body language, and you're not sure if it's like a microaggression or not, I would say the safe way is always just to call it out, right? If you call it out, there was no ill intention, nobody got offended, it's fine. But the more you call it out, the more safe space you're creating for the people around you. And oftentimes perpetrators don't necessarily have ill intent, right? It's the culture they grew up in, the things that they heard their parents say, and they're not trying really to aggress you. But that doesn't mean that doesn't make other people feel uncomfortable. And so just talking about it with people in your workplace, people in your friend group, like, oh, what kind of microaggressions do you experience? What things make you uncomfortable? Constantly just like reevaluating, being introspective, I think is what really helps reduce microaggression in society.
I think a good way to combat the situation at hand is through things like this, spreading awareness of getting my side of the story, and just so if people who commonly give out to microaggressions hear stuff like this and understand it's offensive, they'll be better aware and they will say as ignorant things that they do. But on the victims' end, I think it's important for them to just educate them. Like, you don't really need to be aggressive or violent, just like explain to them with words, try to get them to understand like why that's not cool, why that's wrong. And then on the other end, from the perpetrator, they should definitely just make themselves a lot more educated on this issue. Like speak to either anyone of color or like their friends, but in a kind of non-offensive way, just naturally talk about it, and definitely be open to hearing like our side of the story. And like if we tell you that's wrong, that's not cool, like you can't really argue that, like it's our lives. So just have open ears and open mind.
Okay, so when I think about how to advise people who are victims of microaggression versus aggressors, it's a little difficult to not have the discussion about both and what both sides can do to rectify the situation. I think for aggressors or people who are saying the microaggressions, to have empathy and to understand different cultural backgrounds, where people come from, and listen. Most of all, listen with an open mind, because we all live in our own bubbles and it's understandable. I know what was fair, baby, lately, you've been all on my brain.
Research has shown that being the victim of microaggression can lead to distress, confusion, anger, worry, and other long-lasting emotional effects. Experiencing greater amounts of microaggressions may contribute to mental health difficulties such as depression or anxiety, and physical health consequences such as pain and fatigue. Because being subjected to microaggressions can cause such responses, it can certainly be difficult to know how to eliminate it. Raising awareness and educating about the experience of microaggression can help both victims and perpetrators bring this transgression to an end.